Okay, so now we have two things to do in this video. We want to explain and configure VTP. We want to explain and configure trunking. Alright, so let's start with trunking first. So what exactly is trunking? So you see that this switch 1 is using port number 10, which is F0/10, to connect to switch 2, also on F0/10. Just in case your port numbers are not showing on this diagram, please, you have to go to options at the top here on your packet tracer and go to preferences, and here you have to tick this box, always show port labels in logical workspace. If this box is not ticked, then no port will be showing. You can see I just untick it and all the ports disappeared from my diagram. So always make sure that is selected. All right, so once that is selected, close out of here. Okay, so we could see this port is using this port 1010 to connect the two switches together using a crossover cable. Please note that for VLAN traffic to move from switch 1 to switch 2, the link has to be trunked. Okay, so we need to configure trunking on this side of the switch and also on the other side of the switch. If trunking is not configured between the two switches, VLAN traffics will not be allowed to move from one switch to the other. Let me also clarify that if you are connecting two switches together and you are not doing VLAN, please, you don't need trunking. So trunking is not needed when VLAN is not configured. So I could actually connect two switches together and somebody on this switch can talk to somebody on this switch, which is a normal LAN, a local area network. In that case, trunking is not a necessity, it's not required. For somebody in switch 1 to talk to somebody in switch 2 is only required when VLAN is configured. Okay, so for traffic on VLAN 2 to move over from switch 1 and get into switch 2, maybe to access ICT or to access anything, just know that in a VLAN environment, for traffic to move from one switch to the other, trunking is configured. So trunking is what allows VLAN traffic to leave its own switch and get to another switch. Just take note of that. If we do not have VLAN, we do not need trunking between the two switches. Okay, so since trunking is what will allow traffic from this switch to move on to the other switch, how do we configure trunking? By definition, if I pull out I think I could quickly write somewhere here. So trunking is also known as port tagging. Okay, so trunking is a Cisco name. Other vendors will call it port tagging, right? So trunking is a way of allowing VLAN traffics, is a way of allowing VLAN traffics to move from one switch to the other on the network. Notice the keyword here, VLAN traffics, which means that there must be VLAN existing before we even think of trunking. It's not any time you connect one switch to the other, say, oh yeah, let's trunk. If you have a LAN and switches connect to each other, trunking is not needed. If you have converted your LAN to VLAN and you want traffic to move from one switch to the other, there must be trunking configured. I hope that is clear enough. So let me go and set up trunking on the two switches. So we click on switch 1, we click on CLI, and you already see that switch 1 is using port number 10 to connect to switch 2. So switch 1 is using port 10. So let's get into the do enable conft, which is configure terminal, and we'll go to get into that port 10 by typing interface F0/10, and we do the command switch port mode trunk. And that's it. That's how to configure trunking. So that makes that port a trunk port, and a trunk port is allowed to pass VLAN traffic through it. So we are going to end the configuration. All right, and then when you trunk a port, the port goes down. So you don't do trunking during work hours because you are going to have disruptions. You could see this port is showing red now, and we have to go to the other switch as well and trunk it. Okay, so this other switch enable conft. We haven't even changed the name, so the name of the switch by default is still switch. So let's change it to using the command host name, and let's name it switch 2, and go to interface F0/10, which is port number 10, which is what this switch is also using to connect back to switch 1, and we do switch port mode trunk. That's it. And so the 2 ports are trunked now. We can end the configuration, and to save your config you always use write to memory, which is WR for short. Okay, now how do you see which port is trunked in your switch? You do show interface trunk and hit the enter key. So you could see that any port that is trunked allowed all the VLANs. So you can see VLANs are allowed on a trunk port is all the VLANs, which is from VLAN 1 to 1005. All VLANs by default are allowed to pass through a trunk link, which also confirms that trunking has to do with VLAN traffic. So you don't need trunking if you don't have VLAN in your network. So when we do show interface trunk, you could see here that port 10 is what is the status? Trunking. So under status is trunking because we have configured it as a trunk port. So that is trunking requirement. So without trunking, VLAN traffic will not be allowed to move from switch 1 to switch 2. Now you notice that on this switch 2, if I do show VLAN, we are not seeing any VLAN here, right? So why are we not seeing any VLAN? Because we have not configured VLAN on this switch 2. We only configured our VLAN on switch 1, show VLAN, and the only VLAN we could see here is the default. That is the follow-com VLAN. So that is VLAN 1 and is the default VLAN, and by default all the ports on the switch belong to that VLAN. We don't have VLAN 2, VLAN 3, VLAN 4, and all those other VLANs that we have created on switch 1. But don't worry, we have a techniques that will help us to import all the VLANs we have configured here over to this switch automatically, and that technique is called VTP, right? So what is VTP? VTP stands for VLAN trunking protocol. So VLAN trunking protocol, that is VTP. So what does VTP help us to do? So VLAN trunking protocol, which is called VTP, allows network administrators, so could refer to network administrators as us. So allows us to export VLAN configuration files. So we should be able to export the VLAN configuration of one switch to every other switch on our network. So you notice that on switch 1 we have created VLAN 2, VLAN 3, VLAN 4, VLAN 5. All those VLANs created on switch 1 want to export it to switch 2 so that we don't have to come to switch 2 and begin to create it manually again. VLAN 2, name, sales, VLAN. So all those things have been done on switch 1, but we want it to get to switch 2 and possibly every other switches we have on our network automatically. And that's what VTP allows us to do. So if you don't want to use VTP, then what you have to do is to go to switch 2 and start to create the VLANs again for the switch 2, because the ones we've done earlier is for switch 1. Switch 2 also needs its own, and so I don't want us to begin to type it manually again. So what we do is set up VTP, and VTP will allow us to quickly export this config file of VLANs from switch 1 to switch 2. Another thing I want to point out is that VTP has different modes So we have 3 modes of VTP, right? So 3 modes of VTP. And what are these modes? We have VTP mode server, right? So VTP mode of server. By default, every switch is on a mode of server. It means that if your switch is on VTP mode of server, you are allowed to configure VLAN on that switch. There is also VTP mode of client. So VTP mode client, that means that in that switch you are not able to configure VLAN, but the VLAN should be able to import the VLAN configuration files from another switch. So what we are going to basically do is make this switch 1 VTP mode of server. It means that all our VLANs will be configured on switch 1, and I want this switch 2 to receive all the configured VLAN automatically from switch 1. It means that switch 2 will have to be on VTP mode of client. So it has to be on client to be able to download a VLAN config file from another switch. If both of them are server, it means that we have to manually configure VLANs also again on switch 2. And then the third mode is VTP mode transparent. So if you don't want to use VTP, you want to disable VTP, then you can use a mode of transparent, right? So these are the 3 modes of VTP we have, and what we basically do here is make switch 1 a mode of server, which is our server where everything will be configured, and then make other switches receiver by turning them to client mode, and that means they will be asking for the configuration files from switch 1. And then there are 3 things we need to configure inside VTP, and those 3 things are VTP domain name, VTP password. So we want to make sure that the domain name is the same in all the switches. We want to make sure that the VTP password is the same in all the switches, and then the VTP mode can be different, because one switch can be on a mode of server while the receiver switch will be on a mode of client. All right, so let's quickly get these guys configured because the time is ticking. This video is already 12 minutes, so let's get into the switch. So I will do switch 1 first. So this is VTP configuration. So do enable, we do conft, and here we are going to say VTP mode server, right? That is making the mode server, telling us that the switch already is server mode. The next thing to do is VTP domain. So domain is like facebook.com, or just put your company name there. So in this case, I'll put fibertrain.net. That is our domain name. Make sure that this domain name is the same in all the switches. Is a must. And then the last thing to configure is VTP mode. VTP password. We've already configured mode and domain. So VTP password here, let's use Cisco as a password, Cisco 123. If this password is not the same on the other switch, there will be issue. So please make sure that the domain name and the password is the same on all the switches. So that is how to configure VTP. End the configuration and WR to save your configuration. So let's go to the other switch. And what mode do you think switch 2 should be configured on? Your guess is as good as mine. It should be on client, so that you will be able to receive all the VLANs we have configured on switch 1, and all those VLANs will show up in switch 2 automatically. So click on switch 2 and click on CLI, which is command line interface. We have to do enable, we have to do conft, and here we are going to configure VTP. This will be VTP mode. Note that this switch is a receiver, so it should be on client. And we do VTP domain, it must match, which we use fibertrain.net on the other switch. So this will be fibertrain.net, and we are going to do VTP password, which must also match, and we use Cisco 123 on the other switch, and that's it. And hit enter again and WR. Alright, so as it stands now, the VLANs we have configured on switch 1 should automatically appear on switch 2 as we talk. So how do we verify that? So I probably have to go to full screen on the switch, and here we can do show VLAN. Before, the last time we did show VLAN, we didn't see anything except the default VLAN. So you could see the magic of VTP and trunking that VLAN 2, VLAN 3, VLAN 4, and VLAN 5 are now showing on switch 2. So it has saved us the stress and the time of coming here to do VLAN 2, name sales, VLAN 3, name HR. So those things are the things we did on switch 1, but with trunking configured and VTP configured, switch 1 as VTP mode, switch 2 as VTP client, the VLAN configuration files have been exported to switch 2 courtesy VLAN trunking protocol or VTP. So this is where we'll stop here, and then in the next video we are going to assign port numbers that these systems are connected to on switch 2 to their respective VLANs, which is VLAN finance or VLAN 4 for finance department and VLAN 5 for ICT department. Thanks a lot for watching.